A Roman scientist once wrote that a woman on her period could kill a beehive just by walking past it. Also, sour the wine, rust iron, blunt a razor, wither the crops, and if a dog tasted her blood, that dog would go rabid. He wasn't a crank shouting in a market square. He wrote the most respected encyclopedia in the Roman world, and educated people believed him for the next 1,500 years. 5 seconds. Subscribe, like, share with one curious friend. Done. Legend. Back to the story. Here's why that matters to you. Roughly half of every generation that has ever lived spent something like a decade of their life, cumulatively, across a lifetime, dealing with this. It is arguably the most common recurring human experience there is. And if you go looking in the history books for what they actually did about it, there's almost nothing there, a gap. So today, what they believed, what they actually used, why the record is so thin, and the scientific theory about this that was still being printed in real medical journals within living memory. But first, back to our man. Pliny the Elder, 1st century, writing the natural history, the encyclopedia of everything the Roman world thought it knew. He's genuinely brilliant in places, and then he gets to this subject and produces a list that reads like a curse. New wine turns sour. Crops touched by her wither. Grafted plants die. Garden seedlings dry up. Fruit falls off the tree she sits under. Mirrors dull. Bronze and iron rust on the spot. Bees drop dead in the hive. It is, and I mean this sincerely, one of the great lists in human literature. And here's the part that stops it being funny. Pliny was not describing folklore he thought was silly. He was writing it down as natural science, in the reference book, for serious people. This wasn't the superstition at the edge of Roman thought. This was the middle of it. So where does an idea like that even come from? For that, we have to go back a few centuries, to Greece, and to a theory about the female body that is genuinely one of the strangest things anyone has ever believed. Greek medical writers had a problem. They were trying to explain a body that none of them had. And the answer some of them landed on was this. The womb is not fixed in place. It wanders. It moves around the body of its own accord, like an animal living inside you. And when it goes wandering, it presses on things and makes you ill. Plato describes the womb as a living creature that gets restless. The condition it supposedly caused got a name from the Greek word for womb, hystera, which is where we get the word hysteria. That word sat in medical dictionaries describing a real diagnosis into the 20th century, a word built entirely on a body part that was believed to roam around like a cat. And what did they prescribe? Marriage, pregnancy. The consistent recommendation in these texts for centuries is essentially, this will resolve once you're married and have children. That is not medicine. That's a social expectation wearing a doctor's coat. Hold that thought, because the actual practical answer to all of this eventually shows up, and it shows up out of a war. Aristotle had his own theory, and it's a masterpiece of confidence. He decided menstrual blood was the raw material of a baby, the substance, the stuff, the clay, and the father's contribution was the form, the design, the actual spark of life. So, she supplies the bricks, he supplies the architect. Guess which of those two jobs got treated as the impressive one for the next 2,000 years? Then Galen, the most influential doctor in the ancient world, folds it into the theory of the four humors. Women, he reckoned, are colder and wetter than men, so they can't burn off their surplus blood. And menstruation is the body dumping the excess, which incidentally meant this was seen as healthy, a necessary purge. That framing lasts, in various forms, for over 1,000 years. Now, notice what all three of these men have in common. Pliny, Aristotle, Galen. They are constructing elaborate, confident, internally consistent theories about a bodily process none of them has ever had and cannot ask about, because the people who could tell them are not the ones writing the books. That's not a small bias. That's the whole problem, and it echoes down the entire story. Which brings us to the rules. Because once a culture decides something is dangerous, it starts writing regulations about it. Ancient texts across a lot of cultures treat menstruation as a state of ritual impurity, a temporary condition requiring separation and then purification. Leviticus lays out a version of this in some detail. How long, what she touches, what happens after. Whatever you make of it, it's one of the oldest written engagements with the subject we have. which is telling in itself. The rules got recorded carefully. The practical details didn't. Now, you'll often hear that medieval Christian women were flatly barred from church during their period. And here's a genuinely surprising bit of paperwork. Around the year 601, Pope Gregory the Great wrote a letter answering exactly that question and said no, they should not be barred and shouldn't be blamed for a natural process. Did that settle it? Absolutely not. Local practice varied enormously across 1,000 years and a continent. Some places and periods were far stricter than the top of the church was, which is a good general lesson about medieval history. What the rule book says and what your village actually does are two very different documents. So that's what they believed, and that's what the rules said. Now the bit you actually clicked for. What did they do? And I have to be straight with you, because this is a channel that doesn't invent things. For large stretches of history, we genuinely do not know in detail. There's a lot of confident nonsense online about this. What we can say is what materials were available, what a handful of sources mention in passing, and what archaeology can and can't tell us. And archaeology mostly can't, because whatever they used was cloth, or wool, or plant material, and all of those rot. A bronze helmet lasts 3,000 years. A piece of linen used once and washed does not. We have the swords. We do not have the everyday things. But here's the practical thing nobody tells you. And once you hear it, the whole picture changes. It isn't about the blood. It's about the underwear. Specifically, for most of European history, women weren't wearing any drawers. Underwear, as we'd recognize it, were not standard for women in Europe until roughly the 19th century. Men wore them. Women, largely, did not. You wore a long linen shift next to the skin, and then layers over that, which creates an immediate and obvious engineering problem. Because if you want to hold a folded cloth in place, you need something to hold it against. No underwear means no anchor. So the options are, rig something, a belt around the waist with cloth pinned or tied to it, which is attested, or use the shift itself and wash it. Historians genuinely argue about how common each was, and they argue because the sources are thin. As for the material, it depended entirely on where and when you lived and what you could afford. Linen rags, washed and reused over and over. Wool. In some places, moss or other absorbent plant material. And if you were poor enough, whatever fabric you already owned and could spare, which for a lot of people, through a lot of history, was almost nothing. And then, the laundry. Which, remember, this is the era of hauling every drop of water by hand and boiling it over a fire you built yourself. Washing a set of cloths every month, discreetly, in a house with no privacy and no plumbing is not a footnote. It's a job. It's an entire recurring job that no chronicler ever thought was worth a sentence. You will hear one story constantly, that a woman in the ancient world once threw a used menstrual cloth at a man to make a point. It's a good story. It comes to us from a late source, centuries after the fact, and historians treat it as a story rather than a reported event. I'm including it because you'll meet it everywhere, and now you'll know exactly what it is. So, the record is thin, the theories are nonsense, and the practical detail is missing. And then, in the 12th century, in an Italian medical school, something genuinely different happens. The medical school at Salerno was the best in Europe, and unusually for the time, women were involved in it. Out of that world comes a set of texts on women's medicine associated with a woman named Trotta. Practical, specific, and startlingly unbothered. They cover actual problems with actual treatments in the plain register of somebody who has met the patient. No wandering animals, no withered crops. Just, here is a common complaint. Here is what we do about it. After centuries of men theorizing at a body from across the room, the tonal shift is like a window opening. And that's the thing worth sitting with. The knowledge existed the whole time. Every woman in every village knew exactly how this worked and exactly what to do. It just wasn't the kind of knowledge that got written down, funded, or filed in a library. It moved mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, for thousands of years and left almost no paper trail. So how do we get from a rag and a belt to a shelf in a supermarket? Slowly, awkwardly, and as promised, largely because of a war. In 1896, Johnson & Johnson launched one of the first commercial disposable pads in America. It flopped. Not because it didn't work, because to buy it you had to walk into a shop and say the name out loud to a clerk, and enormous numbers of women simply would not. The product was fine. The silence killed it. Sit with that for a second, because it tells you how heavy the taboo actually was. A useful product, openly for sale, defeated entirely by the fact that nobody could bear to say a word in a shop. Then, the First World War. Kimberly-Clark had developed a wood pulp material as a surgical dressing, cheap, absorbent, far better than cotton, and being produced in enormous quantities for field hospitals. And the nurses working in those hospitals looked at this astonishingly absorbent material lying around in bulk and started using it for themselves. That's it. That's the innovation. It wasn't a laboratory, or a research program, or a great man. It was the people with the actual problem, noticing the actual solution. After the war, the company had warehouses of the stuff and no wounded to use it on. In 1921, they put it on the market as a product for menstruation. That's Kotex. The modern disposable pad exists because a bandage factory needed something to do with its surplus. But the silence problem hadn't gone anywhere. So the shop solved it with genius. The boxes were wrapped in plain paper and stacked on the counter, and next to them sat a tin. You took a box, you put your coins in the tin, and you walked out, having said nothing to anybody. An entire retail system designed around not making you speak. The advertising had the same problem. Early campaigns ran enormous amounts of text about freedom and confidence, and those days, dancing around the subject with such determination that a modern reader can genuinely struggle to work out what's being sold. In 1931, a doctor in Colorado named Earl Haas patented an applicator tampon. He sold the patent on, and it became Tampax. And then, because progress here is never fast, the belt and pad arrangement stayed standard for another 40 years, until self-adhesive pads arrived around 1970. That's within the lifetime of a great many people watching this. So, that's the practical story. Rags, belts, a war, a tin of coins, and a very slow crawl to a supermarket shelf, which leaves the beliefs. And you'd assume the beliefs died out somewhere back with Pliny and his bees. Here comes the part I promised you. In 1920, a highly respected pediatrician named Bela Schick published a claim. He said he had observed that flowers handled by a menstruating woman wilted faster, and he proposed a mechanism, a toxin, secreted by the body during menstruation. He called it menotoxin. This was not laughed out of the room. It was investigated, papers were written, experiments were run, on plants, on dough, on animals. For decades, is there a menstrual toxin? Was treated as an open scientific question in real medical literature. And here's the number that gets me. This idea was still being seriously discussed in medical journals into the 1970s. Not the 1770s, the 1970s. There are people alive right now who were older than you are when a version of Pliny's beehive was still an open question in print, which means the distance between she can kill a beehive and she secretes a toxin that wilts flowers is not 2,000 years of progress. It's the same idea in a lab coat with a footnote. Same instinct, better stationery. And it survived because of the exact thing we started with. A claim about a body most researchers didn't have, that the people who did have it weren't in the room to correct. Every part of this story, from the beehives to the flowers, runs on the same fuel. The people affected weren't the people writing. So, let's go back to that empty shelf. We have Roman engineering manuals. We have shopping lists from 2,000 years ago. We have graffiti about somebody's neighbor's wine. We know what a legionary was paid and what he ate. And on a recurring experience shared by roughly half of everyone who has ever lived, the written record is close to silent. And that's not shyness. That's not the subject being unimportant. It's a straightforward consequence of who held the pen. History isn't a record of what happened. It's a record of what somebody with ink thought was worth recording. And for most of it, that was a fairly narrow group of people. So, what did women do about their periods before tampons? They improvised, with linen and wool and moss and belts and an enormous amount of laundry. And they passed the knowledge along by talking to each other for thousands of years, while men with scrolls wrote confidently about beehives. The gap in the shelf isn't an accident, and it isn't a gap in what happened. It's a gap in who got to write it down, which makes it the most honest thing in the whole library. And if you want more of the history nobody wrote down, the genuinely unglamorous, deeply human stuff. Go and watch what the Romans did about the toilet. 20 strangers, one stone bench, no doors, and a shared sponge on a stick. It's on your screen. Go.